This paranormal event happened to me just last year, so fairly recently. I should explain that my hobby is collecting vintage toys and have been doing this for most of my adult life. There is no theme to my collection, and I have toys that range from the early 1900s to the 1980s. In my younger years, the majority of my toys were bought from fairs and advertisements in the classified sections of newspapers, but I also visited various antique stores on a regular basis. As time has progressed and the age of the internet has taken over, this has become my main source for my hobby. However, I do still visit antique shops when I can, and it was on one of these visits that my strange experience began. All of my family and friends know of my interest and often report any antique shops that they pass that I may not know of, or even familiar ones that look to have my sort of thing visible. On this occasion, it was my younger brother who had walked past a shop in a village an hour away from where we live, and he'd noticed there were vintage toys visible from the window. It was always an exciting thing for me to hear, and I planned a visit the following Saturday. I had been to that shop a few times, so knew exactly where it was. It did have some interesting toys, and I bought a clockwork tin robot that remains one of my favorites to this day. After exiting the shop, I had a last look in the window, and I noticed a small ad, the type of thing someone had written out on a scrap of paper and asked the shop owner to display. I hadn't noticed it on the way in, which was surprising, but as I read it, I was immediately intrigued. All it said was, "Toys and furniture for sale," and an address. No telephone number at all, or any other means of contact. I quickly snapped a photo with my phone and went to my car. I really didn't like the idea of going to someone's home unannounced, but I checked the address, and it was only around 5 minutes away. I thought it would be stupid not to drive there now. My sat-nav took me straight to the front of the address, and as I looked at the house, I was stunned. It looked like it could have been straight out of the 1940s, unchanged and unmodernized, like it was a shrine to that era. As I approached the door, I felt like I was no longer in my time. Every detail of the house was from another time. I started to think that this person was living in a museum and not a house. But I was very impressed because everything was in perfect order, no disrepair in sight. When I knocked on the door, an elderly gentleman answered and immediately ushered me in before I even got my words out of why I was there. I tried to explain to him about the ad I had seen as he was gesturing for me to follow him down the hallway into his kitchen. My eyes were looking everywhere as we walked, and the inside was as remarkable as the outside had been. More so, actually. As we stood in his kitchen, he must have heard what I was saying, although he didn't seem to be paying attention, because he immediately presented a box full of toys, from the 1940s and 50s mainly, and said to me, "These were my sons. I'm leaving soon, and I want them to go to a good home. I can't take them with me." He was very intense and insistent. I asked, "How much would you like for them?" He looked straight into my eyes and said, "I have no need for money. I'm looking for a good home." I told him that I couldn't do that. I had to pay for them. He looked a little annoyed and said, "I'm looking for a good home. I have no use for money," and picked the box up, handed it to me, and ushered me towards the door. I found it almost funny how forceful and insistent this old man was, and I found myself outside in no time, holding the box of toys. He smiled at me and said, "Thank you," and as I was thanking him back, he closed the door. I placed the box down onto his step, took my wallet out, and posted what I thought was a fair price for the toys through his letterbox. I placed the box into my car and headed home. When I got there, I took the box of toys into my house, along with the purchase from the antique shop, and my wife immediately asked, "How much did you spend this time?" Obviously seeing that I had a box full. I explained to her what had happened, and she agreed I did the right thing by posting the money. Only, when I checked my wallet later that night, the money that I had folded and slid through that letterbox was there in my wallet, folded like I had done, but rather than being on that man's doormat, somehow it had found its way back into my wallet. I was very confused, and felt like I had done a very bad thing, but I couldn't work out how it had happened. That night, I could barely sleep because of the guilt I felt, and I decided I had to go back to the gentleman's house the next day and make sure he got that money. The following day was a Sunday, and after breakfast, I got into my car and set my sat-nav to the old man's address. While en route, I thought about those toys. I had inspected them closely the previous night, and the condition of them was pristine. I mean, they looked brand new. He must have looked after them lovingly over the decades, which increased the feelings of guilt that I had. As I got close to the street, I decided that once again I would post the money through the gentleman's letterbox to avoid any refusals by him. As I pulled up to the address, however, I was hit by a new state of confusion. The house that I had visited the previous day was not the house that I was now looking at. I checked my sat-nav, but it was correct. I was in the place I was meant to be. How did this make any kind of sense? Not only was the house different, but the grounds and garden were absolutely not the same. I sat in my car and tried to think of how this could have happened. Had the sat-nav glitched? I checked the picture that I had taken of the scrap of paper in the antique shop window. It was the correct address. The street sign was clearly visible on the wall of a neighbor's house, and the house number was the same. I was at a loss for an answer. Then it dawned on me. Obviously, there had to be two streets with the same name in this town. Could it be as simple as that? As that solution came to me, however, I realized that as I was staring at the house, my attention was caught by a small military statue standing close to the front door of the house. I had seen and admired that same ornament the previous day as I approached the door. Everything else about that place had changed apart from that small, saluting stone soldier. My heart was racing at this point, and my mind was going haywire. I did not know what to think or do. It was obvious to me that something very weird was going on. I started my car with the intention of going home, but something stopped me from pulling away. A thought in my mind that if I go now, I will always wonder what this was all about. So, I bravely got out of my car and walked up the path towards the door of the house. I had no idea what to expect when I got there, but I had to try to make sense of all this. I hesitated when I reached the front door, then knocked gently. As the door began to open, I fully expected to see the old gentleman smiling at me, but I was wrong. Standing there in front of me was a middle-aged lady. I was lost for words at first. Then I said to her, "I'm looking for the owner of the house." She replied, "I'm the owner, can I help you?" At that moment, I decided that it would be best not to say too much, so I showed her the ad on my phone. She looked at it and said, "I have no ads in any shop window. Sorry, you must have the wrong area." I apologized for taking up her time, but as she began to close the door, I noticed the staircase behind her. Almost everything about that house had changed, been modernized, but that old paneled banister I recognized from the day before. It had been painted, but it was undoubtedly the same paneling I had walked past on my way to the old gentleman's kitchen. It was as if instead of the day before, I had been there 40 or 50 years previously. I have no idea how this could have happened, but it did. I immediately drove back to the antique shop. The only thing I could think of to do was to ask the shop owner who had brought in that piece of paper and asked him to place it in his window. I noticed on my way into the shop that the piece of paper was now gone. This, however, only added to the mystery, as the owner of the shop said he has never allowed ads in his window, and I had to be mistaken. I showed him the photo I had taken, but he just looked at it and said, "You had to have taken that in some other window. Like I said, I do not allow ads in my shop window." He was obviously becoming impatient with me, so I left and returned home. I know I will never get an explanation of what happened to me that day. I wrote down the details of the event and put it into an envelope that I keep with the toys that I got from the old gentleman that day. I would never part with those toys, but there will come a time when I'm no longer here, and wherever those toys end up, my wish is that their story goes with them. This was an odd time in my life, and it happened 10 years ago. After a painful medical issue, I needed surgery on my stomach. Everything went well, but as my job was manual, I had to take 12 weeks off work to recover and rehabilitate. Part of that rehabilitation was to take short walks every day if pain allowed, and I was told that after the set time, I would be fine to go back to my job. I began these walks a week after the surgery and kept to flat rural footpaths near my home. This was mainly because I had bought a few black jogging suits that were a size too large for me, so that I could wear pajama-like comfort after the surgery, but still go outdoors. However, I didn't feel like mixing with people looking like a baggy mess. On the third day of my walks, though, I saw a man ahead of me on the track, but I knew I wouldn't need to worry about coming into contact with him, as he was walking in the same direction as me, and I was walking slowly, as advised. But, after a while, I couldn't help but notice that this man looked like me. He was dressed all in black like I was, and his clothes even looked too baggy just like mine. I laughed to myself as I was thinking that if anyone came up behind me and saw both of us, they would think we were twins that had been arguing. When I had reached my limit that I had decided on, I turned around to head home, and as I shot one last glance in his direction, I even remember smiling at the fact that his hair even had the same profile as mine. That night, I thought about the man I'd seen, and the fact of how similar he looked to me, and then put the whole thing out of my mind, and never expected I would see him again. I was very wrong though. The next day, as I wandered onto the same track, there he was, already ahead of me on that path again, as he had been the day before. And like me, wearing the same baggy black outfit. He was a little closer than the day before though, and my first thought was, he doesn't look a little like me. He looks exactly like me. Enough of a doppelganger to freak me out. Once again, I only saw him from behind, but I was actually scared that he might turn around. I was afraid to see his face. I immediately headed home, and I was very troubled by it. I couldn't stop thinking about who he could be, and why he looked so much like me. I could think of no logical reason other than coincidence, but I didn't feel that was the answer. I decided not to walk along that track again, as there were other places I could walk that were fairly quiet. The next afternoon I went to a local park. Part of it was pretty traffic-free and away from the kids' play area, so I was sure my short walk could be done there in reasonable privacy. I had been walking slowly around a large grassy area and had only encountered one other person walking their dog. I could see people in other parts of the park, but they were far enough away not to bother me. The problem was, I must have overdone it, and I started to get uncomfortable pains in my stomach, so I thought it might be best if I found a bench to sit on for a while, until the pain hopefully subsided. The problem with that was that I could see benches, but also a few more people than I would have liked. I decided, though, that it was more important for me to rest than my modesty, and I headed towards the nearest seat. As I sat down, the pain almost immediately eased and I closed my eyes for a minute. I remained like that until the pain was totally gone, listening to the faraway voices in other areas of the park, and even managed to keep them closed when I heard someone's footsteps pass by me. Then I slowly opened my eyes, and as I focused and looked around, I saw him. That man that looked like me, dressed the same as before, in the same clothes that I was, and what made it even more creepy, he was walking away from me, but on the path that I was sat in front of. It had been him that I had heard walk directly in front of me when I had my eyes closed. My blood ran cold through my veins, and if I had been able, I would have got up and ran. I stared at him as he walked towards a bench around 100 yards away from me, then sat down. I couldn't, or didn't dare take my eyes off him, and like the last time I saw him, I was shocked by how much this man resembled me. I didn't know what the hell was going on, but I knew that there was no coincidence here. I stood up with the intention of heading towards people in the busier part of the park and trying to get home without being alone. Before I took 2 steps, though, I froze. My mind was swimming with questions and confusion, but somewhere in there, there was a thought pushing through. Walk to him. It was saying, find out who he is. I started physically shaking at the thought of doing that, but how else was I going to know? I began walking in his direction, not fully committed to going through with it. But when I was around halfway there, I saw a man and two women coming from his left, and I figured at least when I reach him, sitting on that bench, I will have witnesses. Still terrified, though, I continued towards him, and I tried to gauge whether the three people would reach him before me, and it looked like they would. I tried to hurry a little, but could feel a pull in my stomach, and the pain returned. They were going to pass the bench, but maybe wouldn't be too far past when I got there. By now, I was feeling lightheaded, and almost like I was about to pass out. Then, unexpectedly but happily, the three people stopped when they reached that bench. I was so grateful that they had. It gave me new strength to keep moving forward. By this time, I was only 15 yards from my lookalike and those three people, and then something mind-blowing happened. The three of them sat down. When they did, that man that I had been watching sitting on that bench disappeared. It looked to me as though they had sat right on top of him. They simply replaced him. They were there, and he suddenly was not. My eyes saw no movement of the man, he just simply ceased to be. I seriously almost passed out there and then. Blackness was creeping into my vision, and I heard a buzzing in my ears. I began breathing heavily and regained composure a little, and as soon as my legs would move, I headed home. Everything in my head was a jumble. Those people had not even seen the man that had been appearing to me. What did it mean? The following days, I couldn't bring myself to walk. I have to admit I was too scared. Because of this, I was worried about my recovery, and so I bought myself a treadmill for my home. My recovery walks from then on were done in my house, and I never saw the other me again. When I fully recovered and went back to work, I was able to go anywhere alone, and nothing like that happened again. Sometimes these days, when I think about those spooky sightings, I do wonder if maybe, rather than being malevolent, it could have been a warning to stay at home. Or would that just make me feel better about the whole thing? I haven't heard many stories where the activities that are reported are still going on. Unfortunately, mine is. For over 2 years now, I've been living with the presence of something not of this physical world. Just for background understanding, I live alone and always have done as an adult. I'm a very private person, an introvert for sure. I'm uncomfortable with the company of others, but the entity that has chosen to spend its time with me has not allowed me the seclusion I need, and honestly, I know of no way to escape it. This haunting, as I have to call it, as I don't have a clue what else it could be, started shortly after I moved into my current home, around 2.5 years ago. At first, it was small things that I noticed, like the feeling of being watched. It soon progressed to objects moving from where I'd placed them, and small banging noises waking me from my sleep. Now, though, after sometimes weeks of absolutely nothing, I will have to endure all sorts of disturbances and annoyances. My kettle will be turned off after I have switched it on. My bath taps will be turned back off after I have turned them on. And I've even had objects thrown in my direction like cushions and an ornament once. Maybe the most scary times, though, are when I'm in my bed. I've felt the pressure of someone sitting on the bottom of my bed, really close to my feet. Been woken up by voices being spoken into my ear. At one point recently, my whole bed slid 6 inches away from the wall as I was trying to get to sleep. On a few occasions, I have been woken by some noise or other, and for a split second, I have seen a dark figure in the corner of my bedroom that disappears as I try to focus on it. I would move from this house if I could afford it, but I can't. There really is more to this world than what we are taught about, and I'm sure there must be others out there experiencing terrifying events as I am. I hope I'm left alone soon, and my heart goes out to anyone in the same position as me. At this point in my life, I was searching for answers to questions of the paranormal that were occupying my mind. I was in my early 20s and had a pretty big interest in ghosts and spirits. There were plenty of things to read on the subject, even before the internet happened, and I happily digested as much as I could. I suppose you could call it a hobby, although up until the events I'm about to tell you, I had really no first-hand experiences. This all changed after reading an article in a supernatural magazine that I had subscribed to. The story was of someone's experience with a Ouija board. The story itself seemed a little far-fetched to me, but it did make me wonder if this would be the best way for me to have my own personal experience with the other side. I had spent so many hours trying to make contact with beings that were not in our physical space, but had no success at all. I concentrated solely on the phenomena of Ouija boards for a few weeks, so that I could better understand how to design one and operate it. I bought supplies to make one, as they were not readily available in my area of the UK. And before internet shopping, you pretty much had to walk into a shop to buy anything. I was still living at home with my parents at the time, but I knew they had plans to go away for a week together, and this seemed like the perfect time for me to arrange for my friends to come over and help me with my experiment. I wanted at least 5 people, so I approached my friends and explained what I was planning. I asked the most responsible and sensible of my friends first, as I wanted this to be a serious attempt. In the end, there were 7 of us that night. My parents had left on Friday, and I arranged to have our session on Saturday night. I spent the afternoon placing the chairs around our dining table and the board in the center. I had to use a garden chair as we only had 6. I placed candles on furniture at both sides of the room, so we could do it in semi-darkness. I didn't want to force an atmosphere as such, but had heard that these things worked better away from strong lights. When I was happy with how everything was set up, I went to my bedroom to find a notepad and pen so that I could record any letters that might be indicated by the glass. After finding a half-used pad in my drawers, I ripped off the used pages, grabbed a pen, and headed to the dining room so that everything was set for later that night. The moment I entered, though, I noticed something strange. Before I had left that room, I was positive that the glass was standing upright beside the Ouija board, but now it was upside down in the center of the board. I stared at it for a few moments and convinced myself that I must have done this, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. I went shopping to get soft drinks, ready for my friends arriving later. I had mentioned to all of them that there was no alcohol allowed. I was firm on that. I wanted this to be a serious attempt at contacting the other side. I had arranged for my friends to come over at around 7 p.m, and as they started arriving, we sat in the living room talking about what I had read about how to conduct a séance like this. I was apprehensive, as I had gathered everyone here for this, and what if nothing happened? Not all of my friends shared my belief in the paranormal, and I felt a big responsibility, as I knew some had joined in just to help me. Before I go any further with my story, at this time, I don't have contact with all of the people that were present that night, and therefore have no way of asking their permission or even warning them that this story will be told publicly, and because of this, I will change any names that are mentioned. However, if you hear this story, and you were one of the people that were there that night, I want you to know why your name has been changed. Not everyone even tells those closest to them about events like this one. Anyway, back to the story. When all 6 of my friends were there, and we were sort of happy with the ins and outs of using a Ouija board, we had a drink and chatted about normal things until it got dark. At that time of year where we were, it was around 8:30. Then we filed into the dining room and took our seats around the table. I lit the candles, closed the curtains, and turned off the light. As I looked around at my friends' faces, I could see that most of them were looking a little concerned as the candlelight flickered on their faces. I thought back to earlier that day, and to that glass finding its way onto the board, and knew that this was not going to end in failure. I placed my writing pad near me so that I could reach it when needed, and looked around the room. All of the corners were in darkness, and a circle of dark around the table, Only a small band of the carpet was visible between the two. I picked up my pen and held it over the writing pad and placed the index finger of my other hand onto the glass in the center of the Ouija board. My friends followed suit, and when we were all making contact with the glass, I began. "Is there anyone with us that would like to talk to us?" I asked. The glass without hesitation glided over to yes. I looked around at my friends and could see everyone's shocked expression, and I admit I was shocked too, even though I expected results. I think maybe that was because it was so effortless and immediate. I asked, "What is your name?" The glass moved to Grandad. I wrote each letter in turn, and when it was done I said, "Grandad." I asked, "Whose granddad are you?" The glass then moved and spelled out Andrew. I repeated this as I wrote it, and looked up to my friend Andrew and nodded to him. He looked shocked, but nodded back to me in acceptance. I asked, "What message do you have for Andrew?" The glass began traveling again, and at first as I wrote down the letters it was pointing to, it seemed like it wasn't making sense. Itsaboy. I realized when I looked at what I wrote that it was 3 words, and it said, "It's a boy." I repeated that as I looked at Andrew, and he was staring wide-eyed at our other friend Paul, and Paul was looking back at him with a shocked expression. To the rest of us in the room, this didn't make a lot of sense, but as we found out later, Andrew's girlfriend had told him that she thought she might be pregnant, and Paul and Andrew had talked about it privately. The glass then moved to goodbye. Everyone was now looking at Andrew, but he sat stony-faced, so I continued. "Is there anyone else here that would like to speak to us?" After the initial movement in the room, the candles had settled to a gentle flickering, but as I asked that question, it was as if some movement in the room had set them dancing vigorously. We all looked around nervously, but could see nothing. Then the glass was on the move again. It spelled out, "I am the darkness." As I repeated the words, the whole room changed. It clearly got colder, and the band of carpet that we could see in the candlelight started to disappear into darkness. The candles now, instead of flickering, began to shrink, their flames now tiny. Our faces were hardly visible to each other, but the tension in the room was clear. I tried to think quickly about what to answer, and I said, "We have no place here for negativity. Please leave." The second the words were out of my mouth, the table started to vibrate. We all felt it, and everyone took their fingers from the glass. Suddenly the glass slid off the Ouija board, across the table and onto the floor. By now we were all standing, and I realized that I was out of my depth. One of my friends made a beeline for the light switch, and we all piled out of the dining room door. There was lots of conversation during this, but as you can imagine, most of it was swearing. Most of my friends wanted to leave immediately, and I begged them to wait a while. The last thing I wanted was to be left alone right then. I eventually convinced my friends to go back into the dining room before they went home. I told them that we had to place the glass onto goodbye, as I had read "You have to," under the promise that I would do it myself. They all thankfully returned with me into that room, and I picked the glass up from the floor, placed it on the board over goodbye, then blew out any candles still lit. I was too scared to stay there on my own that night, so stayed at one of my friends. They had all offered. I went back the next day, and Mark, whose house I stayed at, came with me. We threw all of the candles and the glass in the bin. The Ouija board I took into the garden and burnt it. Even after all of this, I had trouble sleeping for weeks. I was pleased when my parents returned, though. Whatever it was that came through that board was not something I would want to encounter again. Andrew's granddad was one thing, but the entity calling itself the Darkness put a stop to my curiosity once and for all. I thought I would add, Andrew's girlfriend was pregnant and did indeed have a boy.